How y'all doing this evening? Shout out to our in-house DJ for Accented Dialogues in Diaspora presented by the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network. That was DJ Puzzle. How you doing tonight, Puzzle?
Well, man, how about yourself?
I'm doing good. I'm doing well. We're about to be in Mariah Carey season, so I'm surprised you didn't play any Christmas tunes yet, but
Oh, don't even sweat it. That's coming soon. That's coming soon.
mm,
Yep, yep.
um,
We got the host back tonight, homie.
we got both of our hosts back tonight. For the past couple of shows, for those of y'all out there in the audience, please drop in the chat. Thanks, Puzzle. We got Puzzle's bio in the chat. You can also follow him on Instagram and on social media channels at PUT22L3.
Right on. Thanks, Phil. See y'all later.
Thanks, Puzzle. Appreciate you for curating the vibes and the sound for Accented Dialogues in Diaspora. To reintroduce myself to everyone out there tonight, my name is Philip Nguyen. I'm one of your co-hosts for tonight, where we'll be talking about landscapes of lineages, tracing our stories, speaking with the photographer Anmi Lei and writer Jamie Jo Hoang, who we'll get to meet in a second. Before we get to our conversation for tonight, just want to thank y'all for joining all across the world and sharing some of your meals for dinner or breakfast if you're calling in from Pakistan. I want to share a little bit about what the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network is and what it is that we do, what the Accented show is. The Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network, or DVAN, believes that the stories and aesthetics of a thriving Vietnamese diaspora can unite our global community. DVAN's mission is to foster diasporic Vietnamese and Southeast Asian literary voices. DVAN promotes nonfiction, fiction, and poetry to empower artists in the diaspora and inspire understanding and dialogue within our community and with others. We champion our complex and diverse stories for future generations. We are refugees, immigrants, survivors, and descendants, and our stories must be heard. And for those of y'all, if you haven't already, please go ahead and drop a follow and hit the bell to get notifications whenever we have events like Accented or programs or ways for y'all to get involved in the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network. I'm going to go ahead, and since we're on Zoom webinar for tonight, and for all of y'all who are watching this later or listening on podcast, I'm going to pull up DVAN's Instagram page at weare_DVAN. We can find all the information about what we've got going on in DVAN so far. And for those of y'all who may have already been following our page, take a second to further support DVAN and our work to promote Vietnamese, Southeast Asian, and artists of the diaspora. It was Giving Tuesday recently, and I'll have a second to introduce our co-host, but we've got a campaign going on, a matching campaign sponsored by our very own Thanh Nguyen. We've currently raised $14,580 from Giving Tuesday. We are hoping to raise about $10,000 more, which will be matched by a very, very, very generous donation from one of our co-founders and the co-host of tonight's show. To share a little bit more about Accented Dialogues in Diaspora, this really was a project that came out of the COVID-19 pandemic. It emerged as a way for us to provide this intimate space, facilitating collaboration and conversation with our community members, you all who have supported us, 30 plus shows in the making, right? Season to season for the past, I want to say 3 years and running, as well as our Viet and Southeast Asian cultural producers, so that they can talk and share about their work, stories, passions, inspirations, and of course, how we can engage with all of those things, right? And what is it that they're going to be doing next? What was life like during the pandemic, and where do we go from here as a community, right? And of course, we wouldn't have been able to have the show and keep it going for this long without your support. So I want to, of course, thank you. Before I introduce our host, I'm going to share one small modification. If you've been to Accented before, we've played around with the formatting a little bit. We have a few episodes that are slated to run on KPFA, the local radio. For tonight's show, however, we're switching the format back to a more conversational, open, casual feel where we'll have all of our panelists and our hosts together in conversation for you all on screen. It may be produced into a podcast. It will be available on YouTube later. And y'all, as participants, will have the opportunity to drop any thoughts, feelings, questions in either the chat or the Q&A function in Zoom webinar. And so without further ado, to get into our conversation, I'd like to introduce our co-host, Viet Thanh Nguyen, whose novel, The Sympathizer, won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and numerous other awards. His most recent publication is A Man of Two Faces, a memoir, a history, a memorial. His other books are the sequel to The Sympathizer, The Committed, a short story collection, The Refugees, Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, a finalist for the National Book Award in Nonfiction and the National Book Critics Circle Award in General Nonfiction, as well as Race and Resistance, Literature and Politics in Asian America. He has published Chicken of the Sea, a children's book written in collaboration with his son, Ellison. He is a university professor at the University of Southern California, a recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim and MacArthur Foundations. He is also the editor of the Displaced Refugee Writers on Refugee Lives, and he is our beloved and illustrious host. Shout out to Viet Thanh Nguyen. How are you doing tonight, Viet?
Good. How are you, Philip?
Feeling good.
I'm so glad to be back to our roundtable format. And for those of you in the audience who've been around for a while, you remember that we used to do cocktails. Well, here's mine. It's a Negroni. And I'm even going to do free product placement, Philip, made with Vietnamese gin. Some guy, very good gin, like the guys who make it as well. All right, DJ Puzzle, what do you got?
Coco Rico.
Coco Rico. Okay,
I didn't know you were making soup.
There's other things. Okay, Coco Rico and aviation gin, right? Nice, interesting. I got to try that. And of course, Kim Din Pham in our chat has, just gone there, raising my glass of Pinot Gris to the recent passing of Henry Kissinger. I will drink to that. Anyway, great to be here with you too, Puzzle. Great to be here with everybody. We don't have to talk about Kissinger if we don't want to. You can toss it in the chat and all that kind of stuff. I don't want to spend a lot of time dwelling on him when we should be talking about Vietnamese people, Vietnamese artists, Vietnamese topics, and as we will soon hear about it, Vietnamese joy as well. So let me introduce our guests. Our first guest, although both of them will be with us, but our first guest that I'm going to introduce is the photographer Anh My Lê, who was born in Saigon, Vietnam in 1960. She currently lives and works in Brooklyn, New York. She was educated at Stanford University, boo, I'm from Cal, and at Yale University, and has been the recipient of numerous awards, including the MacArthur and Guggenheim Fellowships. Anh My Lê is currently the Charles Franklin Kellogg and Grace E. Ramsey Kellogg Professor in the Arts at Bard College, New York. A 30-year survey of her career has opened at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City and will continue until March 2024. Hope you can catch it. The title of the survey is Between Two Rivers, Giữa, giòng, Entre, deux, rivières. Anh My, glad to have you with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
So it's a real challenge. You gave me 3 languages to do this survey.
I know. It lays out the ground immediately, what you're getting yourself into.
Exactly. We will return to the languages and those origins for you in just a moment. Our next guest is the writer Jamie Jo Hoang, the daughter of Vietnamese refugees who grew up in Orange County, California, and she stresses not the wealthy part. She worked for MGM Studios and later as a docu-series producer. Now she writes novels and blogs full time. When Jamie's not writing, she's wandering, pondering, and chasing experiences. Her self-published first novel, Blue Sun, Yellow Sky, is a Kirkus Review's Best Book of the Year. She's also the author of the just published My Father, the Panda Killer. Hi, Jamie.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Okay. So did you guys get cocktails before the show?
I'm drinking red wine.
Red wine.
Tradition.
Okay. No? I mean, I thought you were going to go make yourself a
yeah, I actually grab a kombucha. Maybe I'll spike it in a few minutes.
All right. Do that if you can. We are going to start off with something that Jamie actually wrote that was partly inspired by something that happened in a previous Accented episode. And then that led to Jamie actually publishing an essay in Time magazine. We're going to drop the link there in just a moment, called Discovering Joy After My Family's Traumas During the Vietnam War. So here you start talking about Vietnamese joy, but it was inspired by what you saw in the chat during this Accented episode. Can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, so I was was watching the episode. I was riveted. It was about two authors who I love. And suddenly a chat came up, and one of the participants asked, "What about Viet Joy? And isn't it time for us to like celebrate Viet Joy? Aren't we ready now for Viet Joy?" And I got so angry. I had to leave the chat. And upon reflection, the reason why I wrote that article was because I sort of realized, and I think this has sort of been an ongoing 20-year process, was that I wasn't really upset with her. I was more upset with myself. Like, I have not had a lot of pride in being Vietnamese. I grew up, I in like high school, I had blue contact lenses. I dyed my hair blonde. I did everything I could to try to pretend like I wasn't Vietnamese, even though every day my dad would say, "Look in the mirror, you are Vietnamese." And I think that was in large part because of, getting made fun of for, very Vietnamese things at school. In the article, I talk about this girl who this like really did happen. There was this girl, her name was Jamie, Jaime. And I thought we would be BFFs right away because we had the same name, right? Obviously, we should be best friends. And we were walking to the cars after school, and I was like, "Hey, do you want to have lunch tomorrow?" And she was like, "No, my mother would kill me if she knew that I was hanging out with your kind." And I knew immediately what that meant. And I think, there have been many moments like that throughout my life, where I just felt like being Vietnamese was not something to be proud of. And it was not until probably in my like late 20s that I really started to appreciate being Vietnamese, and I had to make that shift. And so the article is all about kind of coming to that realization, but also recognizing that even 20 years later, I still have that inclination, that impulse to be like, no, Vietnamese people, there's no Viet Joy. We can't, what is Viet Joy, right? We are about suffering. And yeah, so that's kind of where that article came out. And I'm not going to lie, when I wrote it, I put in DVAN, and then I got really nervous that y'all were going to be pissed that it was in there. And I was like, but then I also thought maybe I could get on the show. And so it worked.
Yes, we're not afraid of debate and discussion here. That's not a problem. But I'm, fascinated by the topic of Viet Joy and whether it exists, and how do we access it, and how does history and get in the way, the history of the war and refugee experiences and all these kinds of things, family traumas that are related to that. And I think we touched on this topic in earlier episodes as well. And I just want to keep on pursuing that because I think, it would be great to have Viet Joy. I'm kind of a pessimist. So I don't know, I'm not exactly, it's hard for me to be joyful, right? So I want to hear from people, people in the chat, if you know what Viet Joy is, drop it in the chat, or put it in the Q&A as well, and we can talk more about it. But, part of what you were describing in terms of this chat that you were reading while we were talking about war novels, I believe, during that episode, was this idea that the war in Vietnam is just too much in our consciousness as Vietnamese refugees or Vietnamese Americans or Vietnamese diaspora. And it interferes with the joy, right? Because some of us are always hung up talking about the past for good reason, but I understand why people would be like, when can we move on and talk about it? Talk about something else. And, on me, your career as a photographer is obviously a very long one, 30 years, and you've dealt with many different kinds of topics. But one of the themes is definitely war in your work, both the war in Vietnam as experienced by Vietnamese people, but also the war as experienced by Americans, reenacted by Americans, and then contemporary war in terms of the kind of work you've done photographing the American U.S. Navy, for example. So I just want to hear your take on whether we're, as Vietnamese people, too hung up on this topic of war and whether it interferes with our ability to be joyful.
Well, I think that perhaps the way people talk about Viet Joy is a little too simplified. I think we're talking about perhaps love, celebration, and so many more things and beauty. And I think all of those things can be found in trauma and in war. And I don't, to go back to us being hung up on war, I don't think we're hung up on war. I think that it's important to understand what happened. I think there's so much to learn from history, and conflict is constant. It's still going on. So I think understanding the past helps us hopefully make better choices in the future. It hasn't happened so far. So I think within that exploration, there's plenty of room for Viet joy. And one of my big interest, and I think I was kind of scared of it at first when I started. I look for beauty, when I photograph within this complex subject. And, it's a particular kind of beauty. It's a complicated beauty. It's perhaps what you call the ineffable or the sublime. But it's there. And I think that we need to be a little bit more open-minded about the different layers of experiences.
So let's follow up on that, because your photographs are, again, oftentimes about very serious things like war and the military-industrial complex, weaponry. You returned to Vietnam at a much earlier period in not Vietnamese history, but the photos are also really beautiful.
Yeah.
I think, they're striking. And I remember when I once saw you at the Hammer Museum, this was many years ago, when you were touring the show Small Wars, you got a critical question from the audience about...
Yeah.
You remember this, right? It sticks in our mind.
And it actually helped me many years later start a new project.
Oh, can you recount the question from your memory? Because I think it really...
Yes. And this is when, so I finished photographing. So I spent years photographing in Vietnam. And I avoided, with a passion, anything that had to do with war. And it's interesting because all of my friends would come to me, write to me, or fax me when I was in Vietnam. Oh, maybe you should go to the highlands. Maybe you should look at the effect of Agent Orange. Maybe you should go. It's like, I have no interest. And all of those pictures of Vietnam, maybe towards the end, there were a few whiffs of kites looking like airplanes and things like that, but they avoided everything to do with war. So next, then I found these guys who reenact the Vietnam War and could address that issue of war, or the Americans' idea, or Americans' mythologizing of the Vietnam War. And so I worked with them. And I think that's when I started, when I gave that talk at the Hammer. And so this person asked me, but aren't you just fetishizing the military? And for a second, I was just like, well, I don't think so, but it kind of stuck with me because I think fetishizing kind of simplifies the issue. But at the same time, it's a really interesting psychosexual dynamic. And so that stayed with me. Something else that stayed with me was when I worked with the reenactors. I never thought that I would become such an important part of the reenactments. But in order to participate in photograph, I had to be in character. So I was given different choices. I chose to be a North Vietnamese soldier or a Viet Cong because it would allow me more flexibility in terms of moving between camps. I could be captured and go on to the other side. And it sounds terrible. But sometimes some of the reenactors, especially the ones who were visiting, would saddle up to me and say, oh, you're so hot, and it's just, it kind of hits you in the face. Okay, you got to focus and you got to make pictures and you just move on. But they're the things that stayed with me. And so, more recently, I had found this porn video. It's from the 90s that kind of stayed with me for many years. It involves American men dressed as Vietnam-era GIs, and a kind of Vietnamese village was reconstructed somewhere. And the two Asian women who arrive on a red motorbike from Full Metal Jacket, I'm sure. And then, there's a kind of gangbang, no rape, but there's a kind of rape. And it's intense and it's so fucked up. I'm sorry for the word. But it just stayed with me. But then the more I thought about it, the more it seems to me it has everything that I've been interested in. It's got the Vietnam War. It's got women. I've been so interested in women and labor. There's disparity of power, the issues of submission, things about colonialism, imperialism, film, everything's in there. And so in the end, I needed to transform it. So I'm sorry, I'm going on, but I needed to transform it. And I came upon the idea of doing video stills and partly embroider the image. By embroidering the image and breaking it down into stitches, you have to kind of slow down in order to grasp the image, right? Because it's all about stitches. And if you get really close, you see the stitches, you don't know what you're looking at really. And you kind of step back slowly and it comes into focus. I must also say that the images I chose had nothing to do with standard porn. I chose images that were more influenced by Goya's Disasters of War, with intermingled bodies, all of that stuff. So that's where that question about fetishizations led me to these embroideries, and they are so time consuming. It takes months to make one. My assistants and I make them in the studio. And they are at the Museum of Modern Art in this red room that also incorporates erotic frescoes from Pompeii that I photographed in 2015 without really connecting the two. And I think that that setup sort of gives an interesting perspective to the embroideries. So I hope you guys will come to New York and see those.
I want to. I find that really inspiring that that you took something that was like could be perceived as negative and then you sort of just like embraced it. I really hope to do that more in my own life.
Right.
I feel
especially
like
as sorry, Jamie, especially as
yeah.
I mean, a lot of your work is conveyor construed just out, if to our average, the average person who like buys a ticket to MoMA on a date, is more of a more serious or grim tone, or can be construed in that way. And I think as you speak about finding the joy or the beauty or the love in those sorts of things, like trauma, as well as like a collective trauma, but also a very personal, intimate trauma that as descendants of war, as Vietnamese American folks, as folks in diaspora who are living in exile, grapple with over very significant amounts of time, decades even, right? Perhaps more than maybe my own personal existence. I think on Viet joy, and then I think to Jamie, your point around like that, it almost seems like I think there are times, Viet mentioned that he's a pessimist. I feel like I'm like a very sometimes naive, hopeful optimist, right? And for the Accented show, we always try to end on like an uplifting note. But I do want to acknowledge that, I think sometimes we do get a little hopped up or like rushed in to talk about joy, right? And of talking about the positive without necessarily acknowledging this very you mentioned in this time post, guilt, shame, fear, regret, comprehension, appreciation, all the steps that it takes to reconcile with this sort of history. I mean, Jamie, you talk about like wanting to break these cycles and not perpetuate this trauma, knowing what that experience was like for your parents and your ancestors. Can you talk a little bit more about how you grapple with that?
So one of the reasons why I wrote this book was because I was in the car with my dad, and we were driving to Louisiana for a wedding, and him and my aunt were in the front seat, and they were having a conversation about something. I wasn't paying attention. I was a teenager, and I was, too cool for school. But I heard my dad start talking about the whooshing sound the airplanes would make as they passed, and then the sound of bombs dropping. And the way that he described it was, he said, "No đẹp luôn." And I remember thinking like, wow, that is like such an incredible way to describe a horrifying scene, right? To include the word beauty in the description. And as I got older and spent a lot more time kind of reflecting on my parents' history and also wanting to kind of learn more about my lineage. I think that has always really stuck with me because I feel like, to me, that is kind of the essence of Vietnamese people. And it's what I tried to infuse in this story. And so I think when I look at Viet Joy, I feel like we are on the precipice of getting there. Like I don't think, I'm not super pessimistic. I do feel like I feel like within just one generation, you know, we're already moving past it, but not forgetting it. And I think that was like something that I really wanted to emphasize in the article is like, we don't need to erase the war from our memory in order to find or cultivate Viet Joy. I think it's about processing it and then coming to find it. And I think every person's journey is different. So I also think like what's great about the idea of Viet Joy is that it is a personal journey and we can all decide when we have it.
I wonder, you know, like sometimes when we just talk about joy, it can seem kind of simplistic, like or an opposition between joy and trauma. But you know, Amy was implying that there is joy to be found in trauma, and I just want to press a little bit on your line in your bio where you said you're from Orange County, but not the wealthy part. And you know, that's kind of a common theme in immigrant refugee writing, growing up in the not so wealthy parts of certain places, right? And then you have difficult family experiences and so on. But sometimes people look back on these times with actual joy, like, you know, as difficult as those times might be,
Absolutely.
is
Yeah.
joy to be found being with your family, you know, even if those relationships are complicated. So I'm wondering, you know, this is a question for both of you really, but you know, there seems to be, you know, when people ask about joy and war, they're separating the two, but there's kind of a balance and a mixture going on. And Jamie, I'm just wondering if you can just elaborate upon your experiences of home in Orange County, and you talk about the trauma in your writing, but was there joy with your family or your friends in the neighborhood and all that?
Yeah, you know, I was thinking about that a lot recently because I have a lot of cousins and, you know, we grew up really poor. So my parents were always working. They worked 18 hours a day for most of my life. Um, and, but the thing is, we lived in like a fourplex apartment complex. And so my cousins lived in one apartment. And my grandma lived in another apartment. And then my other cousins lived like down the street. And we, you know, because there were so many of us, we were able to make crafts out of like nothing. Like one day we came home and there were these big boxes because the apartment complex next door had just got new water heaters. And so they left these big cardboard boxes outside and we took them and we made these stores out of them and we started selling stuff to the neighbors. And, you know, we were buying and selling and having, you know, we created a carnival like in the front yard. I think that that's one of the things that is really cool about not having a lot of money, right? Like you're forced to be really creative about how you have fun. And those are some of the best memories I have of my childhood, is making stuff from, you know, trash essentially, and really being able to do it with family. You know, I think that's we talk about struggle a lot and there was a lot of struggle, but when you're struggling together, there is a sense of unity. And I do feel like that's the nice thing about having a community. I think that's probably why Vietnamese people stuck together in certain areas of the country and why it's like so great that we now have these pockets where you can go for large Vietnamese events like that. And, you know, yeah.
I mean, I think something that people who emphasize Viet Joy may forget is that within the refugee families, you know, something that was often provided was the safety. You know, that's what the parents did. They provided a safe home for all their kids, no matter how hard the jobs and how difficult. You know, we lived in one of those apartment complex as well, like a one bedroom. So my brothers and I were in the living room. My parents were in the bedroom. And New Year's Eve, what did we do? We watched the ball drop. I mean, I would never even go there by myself and see it physically, but that was so much fun. You know, we'd cook something great a Vietnamese dish, and then we'd watch the ball drop, and that was, joy. Because we were all together, and we had a place to live, and my dad bought a used car, and everything was good. And things could only get better, right? The typical refugee dream of succeeding in America.
And for you and me, I know Viet in his introduction, your bio mentioned your birth year, so we'll let the audience do the math on that. But your trajectory was also particularly peculiar. You were born in Vietnam, in South Vietnam. You lived in Paris for some time, and then eventually fled to California after or a couple of days.
We came back. Yeah, we came back to Vietnam first. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, to talk about like comfort, safety, and home. Can you share a little bit more about?
I wanted to specify that little interlude in Paris was not some sort of fancy, luxurious thing. My mom had a scholarship to go study, finish her PhD, and my grandmother happened to have an apartment in this kind of housing complex for Catholics. So we lived there. We got our coats from the mairie of the 14th arrondissement, which is where the apartment is. It was rough, but it didn't matter to us. We were kids, and we were so excited to be in Paris. But I think that the big difference when we talk about trauma and experience and feeling Vietnamese or not Vietnamese and presenting some of that history is that I was 15 when I left. So I was a lot older, and I had to deal with whatever was thrown at me. And I think that you do feel sorry for yourself a bit, but you just have to get over it. So, it's kind of the reverse PTSD thing, the kids who think everything's fine, nothing bad happened to me, and you just move forward. So it's a totally different thing. But I have to say that I have felt, arriving in Paris and not speaking French. And then, of course, the French kids are so racist. So my brothers and I stopped speaking Vietnamese to each other when we were in primary school, right? If we see each other, we'd start speaking French immediately. And so within a few months, we spoke French fluently because we were too embarrassed. I mean, the jokes were ridiculous. It was like, why do Asian eat rice? And then, lemon skin, they would call us. It was crazy. But at the same time, my grandmother, would go food shopping. She would put on her áo dài. She would, do her hair the Northern Vietnamese way and walk straight. And people would come and compliment her, And so at the same time, I felt like, oh, she shouldn't stand out so much. But I was also so proud that she was, she kind of owned up to who she was. And I think I learned something from that in terms of just trying to be yourself. I never saw her as like wanting to be anything else but her authentic self. Or I shouldn't use that word authentic. It's kind of problematic. But yeah, so I think my grandmother was actually a great role model for me.
And for you and me, we, fortunately, we're back in this roundtable. We're on Zoom, so we have some slides. I want to kind of get into. I mean, you refrain from using the word authentic. It evokes a sense of like liminality, or this liminal space of like being in between places, in transition, especially as we're talking about like home. I think for me as a Vietnamese American, like what home is, what like the quê or quê hương is for my parents is different from like where I currently live and what I call home, even though my quê technically is like the same place, right? But your exhibit titled Between Two Rivers, Giữa, giòng, and I'm not going to try and pronounce the French. We have some images of it if you want to share a little bit more about like what folks might expect if they were visiting the exhibit, or if you could talk about what it means to be between two rivers.
Yeah, I think that when I came out of grad school, I so badly wanted to understand more about who I was, where I came from, and where I really belonged. I think it's some kind of identity crisis that many people have. I could live in the States and felt comfortable. I could go back to France, I'd be fine too. And so being able to go back to Vietnam in the mid-1990s was really important to me. And I think in some ways I was hoping that maybe that would be my found place. And I think I quickly realized that it would not be so. But what I learned was that my home is being an artist, you know, and once I accepted that, it seemed that it didn't really matter, you know, culturally what I was. I was a mess. I was not like anybody else, and you know, you're pulled in all different directions. But I think as an artist, it's okay. And once I kind of embraced that, I think I felt at home. That's my home. And you know, even within the art world, you know, there are places where you feel more comfortable than others. But I think realizing that I am an artist first and foremost really helped me.
That really resonates with me. You know, the question of home is such a preoccupation for refugees and immigrants and, you know, second generation Americans and so on. And yeah, I feel for me that writing is my home too. My family is my home as well, my own wife and children and all that. But then my writing is my home, and it's a mobile home. I can take it with me wherever I go. And so there's joy to be found in that. And, you know, anybody who knows that, like on me, a considerable portion of it deals with war and the refugee experience and the return to Vietnam and all of that. Terrible subjects in some ways, but also as a writer, I find great joy in writing about them, even if the joy is also a struggle at the same time. So all these things are mixing together. Now, Jamie, going back to you, you know, I want to learn more about your process as a writer. We heard a little bit about Anmi's process and her inspirations and so on. But one interesting thing about you is that you accidentally became a writer. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Tell us that story.
So I applied to UCLA. I'm sorry, it's a rivalry school. Undeclared. And I was in my first year there, and I walked into the film school, and I was looking at all these posters and I was like, wow, this is pretty cool. Now, at this point in my life, I'd seen like 5 movies, because we had 5 movies on VHS that we just watched over and over again. So I had no business being in this space, but I went in and I picked up an application, and it said they take 30 students from within UCLA, or 30 students total, 15 from within UCLA and 15 from outside of UCLA. And I just thought, what the heck? I'm not going to get in. I'll just apply. And I filled out the application, and I got an interview, which was like a miracle. And so I'm sitting outside of the office, and this girl comes out who had just interviewed before me, and then the administrator comes out, and she's like tears in her eyes. She's just crying, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm gonna have to follow this girl who just made the admins cry. I'm definitely not getting in now. And I went in, and they asked me, of course, their first question was, what are your 5 favorite movies? And I panicked, and I said a movie, it was called The Picture Bride. I'd never seen this movie. It was just, there was a poster of it in the hallway, and I remembered it, and I just said it. And then I thought, oh my God, if they ask me anything about this movie, I am majorly screwed. But thankfully, the movie was edited by a faculty member. And so they were so excited that I loved that movie that they started telling me all about all the things that they loved about the movie. And I didn't have to say anything, which was amazing. And then we got to the portion about my 5-page, my sample pages. And I had written 5 pages about how my mom was on a phone call with my grandma, learning about how my uncle had been sent to a re-education camp. And the administrator that I had seen earlier, she started tearing up again. And I realized that she actually was crying because she had read my 5 pages. And that was I think the first time that I realized that I had the ability to evoke emotion with words. Prior to that, I had not really written anything, you know, other than English essays. And I was like a B English student at best. So I think after that, I sort of realized like, oh, I think this is something that I would really love doing. And I got in, went to film school, definitely did not belong there. Worked in Hollywood for a little while, and also did not belong there. And then I moved to Houston, actually, because purely because I didn't know anybody. And I was 26 at the time. And I thought, before I turned 30, I better get my life together. So I gave myself 2 years to write my first book. And I wrote that book kind of knowing that it was sort of like a master class in writing for me, because I think I always knew that if I was going to tell this story, my father, the panda killer, I had better know how to write. I wasn't going to touch my parents' story without some kind of confirmation that I had skills. And so at the front of the book, I should mention, I don't know if your guys' copy had this, but at the front of the book, I state that this book is not a history lesson. It's really important for me because I feel like this book is definitely a second gen book. It's written from a second gen perspective. And part of that is understanding that I don't know the history. I think I really struggled with learning about Vietnamese history in my American history class. I think that was like kind of a rude awakening for me in high school when I was seeing images of my family. You know, we never talked about the war. My parents didn't discuss what happened. And so my first foray into the Vietnam War was in school. And I just saw these horrifyingly graphic images of Vietnamese people. And like, it didn't sit well with me. And I think for me, I sort of understood that was not the whole story. And I've always felt like there's been this kind of gap in what we can, what we know as Vietnamese, the Vietnam War or the history. And it's very one-sided, obviously. And so I wrote this book, with the full understanding that like, I'm not trying to retell a refugee story. I'm simply trying to understand it from the perspective of someone who doesn't have all the information and is really looking for it. So if you don't mind,
we're going to hear you an excerpt from that. But before you do, can you tell us the significance of the title, My Father, the Panda Killer?
Yeah. So it's a pretty provocative title. I actually thought when my husband came up with the title, but when I posed it to the publishers, I thought there's no way they're going to let this go to press because it says killer in it. And this is a young adult book. For sure, they're going to nix it, but they loved it. And so in the book, there's a scene. So the book is told in a dual timeline perspective. It's Jane as a teenager growing up in the 1990s with a father who has PTSD and is abusive. And then the other perspective is her dad's journey from Vietnam to America as a Vietnamese refugee, as told through her lens. So she's telling her younger brother the story about their dad. And in the book, there's a scene where they're at this carnival and the lights are blaring and all of the carnival sounds are going off, and her dad plays this basketball game over and over again to try and win this bear. And, he loses a lot of money playing this game. And then finally he gets it and he hands her this panda. And this panda is this bear that she has had since she was 6 years old, all the way up until now, and still is like her comfort animal. And in the retelling of the story that she's telling her brother, there is a scene on a boat where her dad ends up murdering this panda. And for me, that is kind of Jane's recognition of her dad's loss of innocence at a really young age. And so it's really important for me to show that she recognizes that his kind of journey going from like a child and then having to experience the war. And it's really a way for Jane to sort of build a road of empathy towards her dad. So yeah, that's how the title came about.
So before we get to audience questions, Jamie is going to read us an excerpt from My Father, the Panda Killer. And if you haven't put questions in the Q&A yet, please do so now.
So this excerpt is it's right after Jane has received a really rough beating from her dad, and she is in bed with her younger brother Paul, who's 7. When I find my bed an hour later, I know I'm going to be okay. I lay a washcloth across my lower back and toss a bag of frozen vegetables on top. But half the bag misses the landing mark, and the cold instantly causes my back to arch in pain. I quietly curse, turn onto my side, and reposition the bag. When I open my eyes, I see him sitting at my feet. Are you okay? Paul. Paul is here. I open my mouth to say something, but an emotional pressure on my larynx stops me, and I nod instead. The movement tweaks a nerve, and a wave of pain flashes from my throat to the back of my neck, where it settles into a pulsating rhythm of spasms. I try to hide it. I made you alphabet soup, but it's cold now, Paul says. Alphabet soup is the cure to all ailments. When our mom left and cooking became my responsibility, the only things I knew how to prepare were canned foods. The instructions were easy enough. Open can, pour into pot, heat until bubbling, pour into bowls, eat. Paul would spit up everything but alphabet soup, so alphabet soup it was. He liked picking up the letters and playing around with them too. Sometimes it made a bit of a mess, and if our dad had seen us, he would have gotten angry at us and made us stop. I would try to get Paul to sound out letters so he was learning while we ate, but really it was to distract from the fact that I felt guilty about laughing and having fun. I liked the mess. When something shitty happens, it became a tradition that we make soup, except this is the first time Paul's made it for me. Usually it's me trying to distract him from my bruises, wincing, or general bad mood. I force myself to sit up and smile when I see my name spelled out in the bowl. I eat my name, then pull together Paul and hand the bowl back to him. He eats the letters and makes the next word, HURT, hurt. A little, I say. He makes another word, PANDA, panda. I nod, because even the simplest answer will cause the emotions I'm suppressing to boil over. Paul brings Panda, my stuffed animal, up from the foot of the bed and places him in my arms.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much, Jamie.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? So obviously, I think all of us here, we've had interesting personal stories and we found a way to make art, not about it, but somehow making art. So students always come up to me and say, oh, and they're not necessarily Vietnamese, this and this happened to me and I want to make art about it. So how would you explain, what is that the kind of jump between having an interesting personal story and figuring out how to make work about related to it somehow?
For me, I think, I wrote this book for probably the first draft of this book was pretty autobiographical. And then with every iteration, it got further and further away from like what actually happened to me. And I think once I felt like Jane was her own person, I sort of knew that this book was close to being ready, because she's not me, but she is me a little bit. And part of it also was like figuring out the doorway in, right? I had mentioned that I really didn't want to step on trying to like tell a refugee story, since I really feel like that's not my place. And so the book includes a lot of magical realism and fantasy as a way of making sure that the audiences know that Jane is making up this story. Now, lots of the details in it are true because Jane has heard stories, in passing, but it's not a direct line, right? So if we're playing telephone, it's not going to be the total truth. And yeah, I think for me at least, once the characters really feel like they are, like I could sit down and have coffee with them and I would have a conversation and I would know what they were saying, then I sort of felt like it was a book on its own.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks, Anmi. And I just want to appreciate how open and vulnerable, but also strong and resilient that y'all have been through the course of our conversation. I want to, again, encourage folks in the chat to drop questions in the Q&A for our panelists. We've got one, and I think on the notion of the personal becoming artistic and the sort of perspective from students and me, there's a question from a Kim Din Pham, who regrets, a prospective student who regrets not having the chance to have taken your class while she was studying art at Bard. She's seen your show at MoMA twice, and she's looking for an opportunity to learn photography from you in the future. She wants to ask about the Domino installation and about the process behind it, and what inspired that particular installation. And I'll couple that with Kanlei's question around also what it means for you and me to photograph in black and white. So on process yeah.
Right, I'll start with the black and white first. I was photographing in black and white when I began traveling back to Vietnam, and black and white is great because it's all about drawing, drawing of space, drawing of a landscape. It's not so clear in color. And so I felt that it would be very appropriate for me to continue using black and white in Vietnam. I know some people equate black and white with the past, and I don't necessarily see that. I find black and white really interesting because in a way you're removing some information, right? You lack all the color. So you're just left with tonality and drawings. And at the same time, because you have less information, I think it revs up your imagination a little bit more. And photographing in color is so rooted in what's happening right now. It's a challenge too. The lighters, of course, we all know what the Zippo lighters are. Traveling back to Vietnam, I was also very fascinated by the fake Zippo lighters that were made in the mid-1990s, right? Because Vietnamese people had to find ways, merchandise to sell to tourists. And so they would fabricate them and then age them and then copy back some of the sayings that were on the original lighters and make mistakes. And I found all of that kind of really, really fascinating. And I've seen some art made by it, and I always thought it was not that interesting or not sculptural or something. Until I think at the beginning of COVID, I bought some used furniture in New York and went to pick it up in somebody's crazy loft. There was so much stuff in there, and I walked through it and looked at different things. And there was this jumbo lighter. It was, 7 inches tall, made in Japan, and it had a heft. It was functional, there was some gasoline in it and you could use it. But at the same time, there was something so sculptural and ghostly about it because it reminded me of, its usage in the war as a talisman, as for search and destroy. So I asked for it and the guy gave it to me. And during COVID, I started going online and figuring out whether you could find more, and there's a real market for those. So I started buying them, and inspired by some of the writings that were carved. It's trench art that were carved by the GIs and often done by Vietnamese craftsmen during the war. I kind of replicated them after taking out, the dates and then some of the locations, because I found that some of the sayings are still so relevant today, whether they're talking about destiny, love, or race, and of course, war and destruction, right? So all of those things really resonated with me during COVID, during the Trump years. So that's how that project came about. And I was buying the lighters in a way that was frenzied, the way you kind of try to hawk something because you're afraid it's going to be gone. And, and it reminded me of the way my mom kind of stocked up her pantry during the war. And when she felt things were unstable, she would be out at the market at 7 a.m, buying more cans and more nước mắm and all of that. And so I kind of wanted to suggest something about a crazy collector that was also displaying the stuff, but then also hawking all of the things. So that's how that project came about.
Can I just say that I have a Zippo lighter right here?
Is it a real one?
Well, it's a real Zippo lighter.
Yeah.
And this is actually mentioned in my novel, The Committed. And I just put the link in here. You see this on the cover of the UK edition of The Committed. I think it's rare. I was like, are you really going to put this on the cover of a book? And said, yeah, we're going to do it. Well, once they went to paperback, they censored it. They're like, this is maybe a little too real. But I was working off the same idea of, the importance of the Zippo lighter, because I saw a lot of these Zippo lighters in Vietnam too. And of course, I didn't buy any for the same reasons that you mentioned on me. But yeah, I mean, that's part of the way that the whole war in Vietnam impacted like art in a weird way. Like, the way that the Zippo lighters are kind of art, the way that when you went back to Vietnam, you could buy things made out of bullets that had been converted into like sculptural pieces and everything like that.
Right.
So not on the high art scale of what you're doing, but still, I mean, craftsmen or craftspeople were making these things as art objects in a way to sort of appeal to American or foreign nostalgia about the war. Jamie, it was actually for both of you, actually. This is a question from Kanle in the audience. Do you think that maybe seeing our parents struggle and never achieve true happiness, this is a generalization, I don't know, I mean, maybe some of our parents did achieve true happiness, I don't know, but from maybe a lot of them didn't, but seeing our parents struggle and never achieve true happiness have anything to do with us never being able to allow ourselves to be the joyous Vietnamese? I don't know if that's actually true for either of you, but that's the question from Kan.
I think that, so one of the things that is actually true in my book is I wrote this scene about how when I was younger, my dad, I remember him saying that like if he was born in America, he would have been an astronaut. And I thought, well, that's bold. Like there's like 3 people who have been to the moon and you think you're going to be able to be one of them. But to me, actually, after like I spent a lot of years thinking about that, and I thought like when he was a kid, he did have these very like lofty aspirations and dreams, and recognizing that actually really helped me kind of understand my parents in a way, and connect with them in a way. And I think that while he is not an astronaut, unfortunately, I think that for them, they, at least from what they tell me, they have found a lot of joy in being able to give us what they didn't have. And so I have, and my siblings too, I think we've really taken it kind of upon ourselves to be happy in a way. Like we try to get the most out of life. We travel when we can. We try to, chase experiences. And that's in large part because we understand that that's not something that our parents were able to do. And so if it's something that they made a sacrifice for, then it's something that we really want to embrace and make sure that, we get the most out of our situation so that we're not wasting their sacrifices.
That's guilt inducing too, though.
Yes.
Don't waste the sacrifice.
And the Catholic
And the
also.
Catholic. Yeah. Yep. We have the Catholic. Yeah.
I do find it interesting. I don't think we can presume that our parents didn't feel joy, or that, obviously some of them didn't, but, it seems there are some, I mean, it's complicated as we've been returning to over and over, the relationship between trauma and joy, and our parents' experiences, and whether we even comprehend what they went through, and whether we can assume that they didn't feel joy.
Can I ask and interject, as parents, do y'all feel a sense of joy? Like, have we broken the cycle? Have we figured out a way to heal from intergenerational trauma on an individual or collective scale? Like what is it that how does joy manifest in each of your lives?
Let's not be sentimental about it. It's like not everybody out there should be a parent. Okay, it's this.
I'm taking notes. I'm taking notes for my.
I have found joy in being a parent, which totally surprises me, because I was like, I thought my life was over when I was going to become a father, but it's been the complete opposite. So there is, and that's what I'm saying. Like when we look back on these glamorous photos of our parents from the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, and then we know what they were going through and would go through. Nevertheless, maybe they did find joy at some point in their lives. But I think, you were going to answer that question too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that joy cannot be associated with stress or, tension, right? And I think that our parents maybe have felt rewarded at times. I don't think they were ever, at least mine were never relaxed. They were always worried about something. And I think that in that sense, they could never fully experience joy because they were waiting for the next bad thing to happen or something. And I have to say that I've inherited a lot of that, but I can be relaxed. And I look at my kids sometimes, and for no reason, I feel joy, just because they're there. So I think it's really tough to try to equate our situations with theirs. There was so much uncertainty and so much pain, and having to leave your home like that and losing everything. It's intense, and I don't think my parents could ever relax, even though they traveled towards the end. Once they were more comfortable and they retired. But I don't think they ever really relaxed.
I read, and correct me if I'm wrong, Unmade, that I read somewhere, I think that you had mentioned that during the war, you didn't feel a lot of fear. I wondered if you could talk about that.
Yeah, because you're a kid. So, and I have to say, we lived in Saigon and more or less we were safe. I was not evacuated on a fishing boat and did not have to deal with pirates. So, I feel really lucky and in that sense. But, there were bombardments, mortars, and rockets falling every night. And one day I would come home from school and my mom had bought all these sandbags and she was lining up our bedroom with sandbags. My grandmother's, escaped death because she ended up spending the night with us, my great grandmother, and the rocket fell into her house. And Tet 68, we lived near the radio station, so the Viet Cong attacked the radio station. So they were kind of stationed in front of our apartment building. My parents lived in a professor's housing complex. And we were on the first floor. So, it's all, I think you just took it as the way it is. And as a kid, you don't, it's like living in Beirut during the war, at the height of the war, it's part of your life. And I think that once I got to the States and watched the news, that's when it was terrifying. Watching the fall of Saigon was terrifying to me. Because I relived through some of that. But on the spot, you just can't. You just got to do what you got to do.
And I think that speaks so resonantly. Yes, thank you. And I think that speaks so resonantly with what we're seeing happening in HD on all of our feeds right now too. As we kind of wrap up tonight's show, and want to thank y'all both for joining us. I want to pitch this question, starting with Jamie, to everyone, including Viet. If y'all could speak, as part of the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network, we're not just trying to uplift and amplify Vietnamese American voices or Vietnamese voices in the diaspora, but also Southeast Asian, immigrants and refugee narratives, voices, experiences. So I want to ask you all if you could speak a little bit more about the ways that you feel your own sense of Vietnamese identity, however complex and contradictory it may be, connects to other diasporic communities, particularly those that are facing, are experiencing what it is like to become refugees. I'll pitch this one to you first, Jamie, especially since in your opening letter to your father, you write about Afghans fleeing the Taliban and Ukrainians fleeing from the Russian invasion, these perilous journeys.
If I'm being totally honest, these past couple of weeks have been really paralyzing for me, because I think I open my feed and I have a kid who's 2.5, right? So yeah, I see these images and I know that it's not something that I experienced, but I think about my kid being there, and I just cannot. It's so painful to think about these children who have, they didn't cause anything, they're just there. And I think probably part of that is because I think, of course, this must be like what my parents had to deal with, you know, during the war. And I just think war is fucking awful. And there's no good outcome. And all of these like politicians' ways of, you know, trying to make it shiny and good for them, it's just painful and I think that, you know, I feel like if we just focus on the fact that all of these civilians are suffering, you cannot look away. Like you just can't, like it's just rough. It's really rough.
Passing it over to Anh on this.
I mean, you know, the Vietnam War ended in 1975 and we're still talking about it. So the effect is just so long lasting, and we haven't learned, and we get engaged in so many other wars since, and it's just abhorrent. And yeah, I think of children, women, you know, it's yeah. I feel helpless, to be honest, and I think a lot of the work that I make comes out of helplessness.
Yeah.
I think it is easy, not easy, but I think many of us are overwhelmed, paralyzed, feeling helpless, powerless, and so on. I will say though that we as Vietnamese refugees and other Southeast Asian refugees or other refugees who are here in the audience and so on, either us or our parents have been through similar experiences as to what we're witnessing right now, live on our social media feeds and so on. And that's a call for me. Like, being Vietnamese is important, but it's an identity, which is different than taking our identity and our experiences and using that to connect with other people, which is what I think we're talking about, you know. And I think my experience has been that, in fact, simply being able to speak out is important. So many people feel silence right now, that they can't say what they believe, for various reasons, obviously. But the fact that people feel silence means that speaking out is actually powerful, because why would you feel silence if your words didn't matter? So everybody's words do matter. Everybody's testimonies do matter. Our memories matter. And so that's where I think, you know, when we go back to the question of joy and trauma and all of that, I think part of the trauma is being stuck in the past. Part of the joy is trying to figure out, how do we not move on as in like just heal and go on to utopia, but how do we use our trauma to do something good? And for me, that doing good is being able to speak up and speak out for what I believe in. Stop wars, which you know, was sent to me by you know, Phuc Dun, who wrote the book Saigon, and he's a tattoo artist and a memoirist, you know, and we just are, I think we're on the same wavelength, because when we did an event together, he wore Stop Wars t-shirt and I wore a Make Art t-shirt. And those are the two things, you know, that I think we as artists who descend from this experience can agree on. We have to make art and we have to stop wars. And that's the lesson that I've learned from our particular trauma, and the joy that I take from that trauma as well.
Thank y'all. Thank y'all for those reflections, and for being so candid and again vulnerable and open with sharing both your work and yourselves and your experiences and all the folks and places and people that y'all come from. Last question before we wrap up will be where it is, can we find you, what it is that you're working on next. Could y'all make that plug? And while y'all are doing that, and Annika from our production team is going to share a survey for the folks who are still kicking it with us. It'll help us improve Accented. 32 shows and going. We're still looking for ways to continue to develop the program, suggestions for guests, ways that we can engage in the conversation, and make sure that if y'all took any screenshot selfies, that you got my good angles. But also to tag we are _DVAN on Instagram or Facebook, and to make sure to stay to follow us on social media so you can stay updated with our posts, as well as the social medias of our esteemed guests for tonight. So on where can we find you and what's going on next? I'll pass it to you first, and me.
I'm taking a vacation. No, I do have a project that I need to finish. It's called Silent Journal. It's some of it is shown at MoMA, and it's about America today. And I've been traveling, and I need to finish it. Hopefully, make a book.
I'm working on the sister book to this one. It's not a sequel, it's a companion piece. This piece is Jane and the father, and the companion piece is Paul and the mom. So I'm working on that now. Told my publishers it would come out 2025. That's looking very optimistic. But you can find me at heyjamie.com and at heyjamiereads on Instagram.
And then back to you, Viet. What are you working on? And to close us out.
I'm giving 6 lectures at Harvard this year. The 3rd lecture is Tuesday, December 5th. If you're in the Boston, Cambridge area, it's actually about Asian Americans, Palestine, and Israel. So perfectly connected to how we're wrapping up this show. Thanks, Philip, for ushering us from the beginning to the end. And thanks to Jamie and to Anmi for being such wonderful guests, and to DJ Puzzle for opening and closing in its incredibly lyrical way, as always.